This lecture will be about the death penalty. I call this a cheap imitation of Dr. John Johnson, who was a professor at Arizona University when I was there in 2000, 2001, my first full-time job. Very nice man. Just to be clear, so I basically sat and watched him and took notes and had stolen this from him with his permission. I hope he's still alive. He is a wonderful dude to me. So he was real clear that he's against it in all cases. He spoke as an advocate rather than an academic, but he did try to um, mention a few things that are related. I am not really speaking to you as an advocate, but I will say that I used to be in favor of the death penalty until I took a course in college and I learned some facts. And when I learned some facts, I just thought, wow, I can't support this. Um, but it did not, for me personally, arrive from the idea that even Dr. Johnson says these people do horrible crimes. So for me, it wasn't a moral issue of having people killed. It was just the things that you'll see as we move on. You are free to have any opinion, but I want you to look at this from an intellectual standpoint, and you're going to realize that there are ways to support the death penalty, but there are not objective ways as much. There's a lot more objective evidence to support the death penalty. Um, and it's fine to do so, but you need to sort of hang your hat on something that's intellectually defensible, which, as you'll see, is sort of the moral argument for it. All right, so we'll cover various concepts here. Okay, the first is the idea of deterrence. So deterrence means is in this context is by having the death penalty, do we deter people from murder? Okay, that's one of the justifications for having it. Um, there are two kinds of deterrence. First is general deterrence, which is the main reason for having the death penalty. It would be that does having the death penalty deter the general public, people at large who potentially might want to kill somebody? Does that make them say, hey, wow, if I kill this person, I'm going to be put to death, so I'm not going to do it? That's the concept of general deterrence. The way you would test for this, it's very difficult to do that, but in a clean, here's a clean way to do it, I should say. In the United States, some states have the death penalty and some don't. Okay, that's the way the United States was set up. In when there was the original 13 colonies, they each had their functioning criminal justice systems. So each of the 50 states have their own set of criminal laws. All of them outlaw murder. Some of them have as an option death penalty. Okay, others like Hawaii does not. So the way you would compare this is you would look at states that have the death penalty and states that do not. If general deterrence worked, Hawaii should have a higher murder rate, or states like Hawaii, states who do not have the death penalty, than states that do have the death penalty, like Texas. Okay. Well, that study has been done, and the fact is, states that have the death penalty do not have lower murder rates on a significant basis, and there seems to be suggestions that the opposite is true. And some researchers have called this the brutalization effect. I don't know what I think it's bunk personally, but the idea would be, oh, because the state kills people, it makes people less emotionally affected by it, and then they go for and kill other people. I think that's BS. But it is clear evidence that the death penalty does not deter the general public. So you compare murder rates of states that have the death penalty and murder rates of states that do not. If the death penalty worked in a general deterrence, you would expect states like Hawaii that do not have the death penalty to have higher murder rates than states that do. And the fact is that is not the case. Okay, specific deterrence refers to an individual, a specific individual. So would the death penalty deter a particular person? That's real hard because the way you would test this is you would have to interview people, and or so that's the hardest one to. So for some people it might, for some people it might not, right? So it's hard to say that. But we do know, for example, there was this serial killer by the name of Ted Bundy who killed a bunch of people in a bunch of states. And he, in fact, went from Wisconsin, to where they didn't have the death penalty, to Florida, where they did and continued killing people. So the idea was that certainly, he went to a death penalty state in Florida and continued to kill people, so that certainly didn't deter him. Okay, it's very hard to do that, and from a crime policy standpoint, you would be interested in general deterrence, right? No policy will fit all the people, but what you need to do is have a policy that works for most people. Okay, so it appears that the evidence suggests that there is no general deterrent effect for the death penalty. Okay, cruel and unusual punishment. Okay, I'll just say one thing. You can make an not oral, against the death penalty on this notion that it is just cruel and unusual in and of itself. Now, the Supreme Court of the United States has disagreed with you. That's why it is still legal. Okay, but one could say, well, I disagree with the Supreme Court. Okay, and you could say, I think the death penalty is cruel and unusual just in and of itself. Okay. But the reason why, but it is important to realize that in the United States, that's not the case, right? The courts have not deemed it cruel and unusual in and of itself, the act of execution. Okay. There was a case called Furman v. Georgia in 1972. For a time, the Supreme Court ruled that the death penalty was unconstitutional and constituted cruel and unusual punishment, not due to the act of execution itself, but because so many states, remember all the states have different laws, right? And that they were saying you could sort of be executed for something relatively a minor kind of murder, if you know what I mean. I don't mean that in a moral sense, but, a less serious murder in one state, whereas I think at one point rape, you could be executed for rape, right? And then in another state, you might not, right? And so they said that was sort of capricious and cruel and unusual. And so they ruled that the death penalty could only be an option for a particular heinous crime. And it said that the states had to come up with, if they wanted to continue the death penalty, needed to define heinousness. And so states that wanted to keep the death penalty did that. So, for example, one state, California, said, well, if you kill more than one people at one time, right, a multiple murder, you could be eligible for the death penalty. Those of you old enough to remember O.J. Simpson and his trial of the century in the 1990s, right? That's why he was eligible for the death penalty, although he did not seek it because he had killed more than one person. I've heard of states where they have the death penalty if you kill somebody over a certain age, etc. Okay, so remember, the death penalty is not ruled by the Supreme Court as cruel and unusual in and of itself, although you may make that moral argument if you wish to oppose the death penalty. You may also say, in my opinion, it's not cruel and unusual, the act of itself, although you'd be in disagreement with the Supreme Court. So that's how Furman versus Georgia applies. Remember, Furman versus Georgia did not rule that the death penalty, the act of execution, is cruel and unusual punishment. Okay, due process rights. This is somewhat related to Furman v. Georgia, if you think about it. But the better way to think about it is it relates to the processing. This amendment relates to the processing of people through the criminal justice system. The way the Constitution was set up is, for example, you can have a right to a jury of your peers if you're taken to trial. Okay, so think of it as the rules that sort of limit the state, or in terms of accusing and then convicting somebody of a crime. Okay. The American Bar Association has called for a moratorium. That means to abolish it or stop doing it on the basis of inadequate legal representation, right? So basically the way this works is in some states, for example, You're not even given a public defender. And so let me just go backwards. So let's say, I believe it was Texas. Okay, so pretend somebody's accused or is eligible for the death penalty in Texas. The prosecution is hired by the state and they have a lot of resources in comparison to the defendant, because many times the defendant is not even given a salaried defense attorney. That are called, oh God, I'm blanking on the defense attorneys that work for the state, what they're called. Public defenders. There you go. So even in a normal situation, the prosecuting attorney has far more, who is a public employee, has far more resources than the individual public defender who would defend the person, right? So that would be one reason why the American Bar Association says, look, these people who are being accused and convicted of death penalty have inadequate legal representation. The Texas example, if I'm right on Texas, don't quote me, but they would actually sometimes give, someplace in the South, they would actually not even have a public defender, but they would sort of give a private attorney something like $5,000 or I don't know, it was a set amount of money to defend a death penalty case. So if you think about that, you're not being paid hourly, so you have a financial incentive to, the less hours you work, the better your minimum wage, if you know what I'm talking about, hourly wage, I should say. So that would be sort of an example where they said, look, that's inadequate representation, okay? It's been estimated that something like 50 to 70% of cases have reversible errors. And then it's also been shown that the death penalty is applied disproportionately to people of certain races and poor people in general, right? There was one study that showed, so they looked at the race of the victim and the person who was accused at it, and the worst odds, which you might imagine, would be being a black male accused of murdering a white female. Your chances of getting the death penalty were much higher than a white male accused of murdering a white female. So a black defendant accused of killing a white female has a much higher chance of getting the death penalty than a white male accused of murdering a white female. So that would be sort of how the argument here would be that the United Justice should be blind. It should not punish certain races. Those things should be all things equal, right? So that would be an argument against the death penalty. You could say, well, I support the death penalty when they get adequate legal representation. I apologize for tripping over my words. But that is not the case right now, so it's a fact. Okay, so the quality of legal representation is so poor that many states that have previously had the death penalty have stopped doing so. I believe Illinois is one example. Another issue in the death penalty is retribution or revenge. It deals with the notion of what is justice for a specific case. Is it just? On the positive side, you could say that it might give closure to the family members of the victim. Obviously, the victim's dead, so you can't give that person closure, but emotional closure to the family. So the way you'd have to study that is you'd have to actually go it's called a longitudinal study and study them over time, right? So I would imagine that at first, when a person is executed for killing your family member, you might be more like, yeah, I feel good about that. But over time, I don't know this, but for some people that may fade over time because it really doesn't bring their loved one back, right? So if you wanted to figure out if it actually gave long-term justice, that's the way you'd study it. I'm unaware of any of such studies. It would be really hard and expensive to do. But that could be a positive. You could say, I'm for the death penalty because I think it's the only way to provide retribution to the families of the victims, right? Now, the negative side is you could say, well, it's the only crime where we kill people to teach people that killing people is wrong, right? We do to the victim, whatever was done to the victim, we do to the person who's been convicted of it, right? So if you're convicted of rape, we don't have the state rape you, right? If you are convicted of beating somebody up, we don't have somebody who's an employee of the state beat you up, right? So that would be the idea where it's negative, right? So the notion of retribution is the punishment should fit the crime. It should be proportional, excuse me. So for example, get outside the death penalty for a second and say you have a person who's convicted of stealing a car one time. You also have a person who's been a career car thief and has been convicted many times. You might say, well, the career car thief deserves a harsher punishment than the person who's only done it once, right? So that's the idea of having that proportional punishment to the nature of the crime, right? Revenge, it's an emotional component. You want the person killed because it feels good, okay, emotionally. They did a horrible act, which is most of the times true, right? And society deserves that emotional satisfaction of knowing that person was put to death. So that's a moral argument, not an objective argument. But you can make it if you so desire. Okay? So there's two ways to go with that. Remember, when you make the moral argument, you can make a moral argument against the death penalty as well. So you can make a moral argument before or after. And one should not argue morals with another person. Like, for example, I have in one of my classes, I allow them to write a paper where they're for or against the death penalty. And I say, don't use religious text. Okay? You can, however, just make a simple moral argument for or against the death penalty, right? Just, again, I think society deserves that emotional satisfaction because that person did a horrible, nasty, evil crime. Okay? You could also say, we shouldn't kill people to teach people that killing people is wrong. That's also a moral argument. Cost. This was the one that really, really, really swayed me when I was sitting in a college classroom. One would think, at least logically, a lot of people think, I've had a lot of students think that, and myself thought, well, the death penalty will save taxpayers money because rather than having them alive in prison with medical care and room and board and clothes and yada, 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 we'll just execute them and boom, we don't have to care for them. Well, as that's the beautiful part about education is you actually learn to look at evidence. The evidence suggests that it's not true. Okay, in fact, it costs approximately 10 times more to execute somebody than it does to hold them in prison at the highest level of security for 40 years. So you think about it, that would most people die in that time period. And if you go 10 times more, right, that means that maybe it's only 7 times more if you hold them there for 100 years. Right? So long story short, it would be far cheaper to put somebody in prison without the possibility of parole. Okay? Now these costs are due to constitutional safeguards or appeal because it is, you'll see next slide, we're going to talk about something called irreversibility. Okay? But because once you execute somebody, you can't take it back, there are certain constitutional safeguards in place, right? And so I've had certain students say, well, we'll just get rid of all those extra safeguards. They don't deserve it. And I say, well, okay. So it's a purpose, right? This person should sort of pay it for other people, right? And so just remember, that would apply to you as well, right? If you were unfairly accused of murdering somebody, getting rid of those constitutional safeguards or appeals would also affect you as well. But anyway, just to repeat, it costs far more, far, far, far more to execute somebody than it does to hold them in prison with life without parole. Now, other people say, well, what if they get out and escape from prison? Yes, that's an infinitesimal risk, but it is a risk. And, I would imagine, I would sort of say that the vast majority of people who are able to escape from prison, and it's not a lot, are eventually caught. But, so it absolutely costs more to execute them. I'm a big guy on, I want my crime policies to work so it doesn't deter people. It doesn't lower the murder rate. And now I found out it costs so much more. So that's sort of like my main reasons. We'll find out another one in a second. Okay, the idea of irreversibility. Remember, once you execute somebody, you can't take it back. if you do put somebody, and this has happened, in prison for life, right, without the possibility of parole, and you find out later they didn't do it, you can let them out, right? And then they get paid a lot of money, right? Now, DNA evidence is not the only reason why this has become important, okay? But it has helped in some instances release when sort of blood evidence or whatever, before they had DNA, was a big part of the original conviction. They've been able to overturn some of these convictions using DNA evidence, okay? But the fact remains that in that time period, there were at least 85 documented cases of putting innocent people to death. And so you could, obviously this is a reason to be against the death penalty, right? Because we put innocent people to death, okay? Yeah, you could say, well, it's kind of like war. Sometimes there's what's called collateral damage. We don't mean to kill civilians, but a lot of civilians die, right? And they just sort of have to die because we're executing, it's a war. And you could say the same thing here. Well, some people are going to have to die, right? So that we can have the death penalty and provide this emotional justice or whatever. You can make that, but when I had a student make that to me in my office, I said, okay, are you willing to be that person? Pretend you are the person unjustly accused, you didn't do it, and they're going to execute you. Are you personally willing to die so that society can have the death penalty? He said, no, I'm not. Okay, but you're willing to have other people die. Okay, so that's the kind of argument. If you're, the only way intellectually you can make this argument would be, yeah, I'm willing to be that person because it's that important. Okay, and then I go, okay, wow, you really are into killing people, even though it costs more money, and it doesn't help lower murder, and these people get inadequate legal representation in a lot of cases, which are all fine things to do. You could just say, I don't care about that. Justice costs a lot of money, right? I don't care about other people if they get bad legal representation. That's a poor intellectual argument about the legal representation, by the way. I wouldn't make that one. And this is also a poor one, just from a logical standpoint, to say, yeah, well, some people need to have collateral damage. You really need to say, focus on other things. Like if you were going to argue in favor of the death penalty, you'd first of all say with justice, right? And then you would say, well, I don't care that it costs 10 times as much. Justice costs money, and you can't put a price on either justice for the family or for society, right? And you could say, well, I don't care that it actually doesn't deter murder because, again, it's the only way to provide justice. You would not want to take on irreversibility or due process because you'd end up looking like a fool, because that's a really poor intellectual argument. So, to repeat, I don't really care what you believe, right? But when I want you to have good, sound intellectual support for your arguments about public policy. And the death penalty is public policy. It does not only apply to you, it applies to many, many people. Okay? Therefore, we need to have good justification for all crime policies, right? Or any policies for that matter, unemployment insurance, educational policy, etc. So that's why I'm sort of getting you to sort of think critically about this. Okay, again, if you have an option to write a paper, you can write it against the death penalty. I'm totally cool with that. One of my strengths as a professor is I've had professors who punish you in terms of your grade for writing things that they don't believe in, that's against them. I'm not like that. Okay, I've given 100%, near 100% for people arguing against the death penalty in a paper when they do a good, sound intellectual argument. Okay, so whether you oppose it or support it makes no matter in terms of what grade I would give you on the paper, and in your general life as well. We're all individuals and have our right to think about certain things. But if you're going to support it, again, I used to be a supporter, but all that objective evidence changed my mind. And it doesn't have to change your mind, but if you're going to support it, at least have a good, sound intellectual argument. Okay, that's the end of the lecture.